Hello, this is Dave in the Wizard's Keep in Muncie, Indiana, and today I wanted to talk to you about my top 10 favorite role-playing games that are not Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I'm a big fan of Dungeons & Dragons, as you can see by the giant wall of Dungeons & Dragons books I have behind me, but there's a lot of other great role-playing games out there that don't necessarily get the attention that Dungeons & Dragons gets, and that's what I want to highlight today. My number 10th favorite role-playing game, it's not Dungeons & Dragons, is Traveller. Traveller is a hard science fiction role-playing game kind of set in the far future. And what I mean by that is there's hard science fiction and soft science fiction. Soft science fiction is much more fantastical, sort of like Star Wars, where there's kind of like these Jedis and supernatural elements roaming around. And then hard science fiction is more like Star Trek, where it's kind of more grounded in reality. Like that's kind of the joke about Traveller, is if the game company had the budget of NASA, they could actually make the spaceships and their other advanced technology, and they would actually work. And that's what I like about Traveller, is that kind of realism of it. My number 9th favorite role-playing game that's not Dungeons & Dragons is Paranoia. And Paranoia is kind of a weird role-playing game because it's kind of a comedy role-playing game because of all the zaniness and the ridiculousness that happens in the game, which is odd because it also kind of tackles serious subjects because it's a dystopian future like 1984 or Brave New World. And the paranoia it comes from is there's the computer or Big Brother that's kind of watching you, making sure that you're not committing any minor infractions which might be considered treason. But that's the thing is everything is considered treason. The rules that determine treason are a bunch of contradictions. So as a result, anything you do is treason. Me telling you about the game right now is treason. And that's kind of the fun of the game, though, is because you're inevitably going to commit treason, and the computer, who is always watching you, also has different weapons lined up everywhere that will strike you down at a moment's notice. But it's okay, because you have multiple clones of your character. So even though your character is killed instantly, a clone of your character pops back up and you can continue on with the mission. Also, the other characters you're playing with who are trying to help you succeed at the mission will also be one of the most likely the people that's going to turn you in for treason, because not turning you in is treason. And so that's kind of the fun and the ridiculousness of the game, and that's why I like about Paranoia. My number 8th favorite game that's not Dungeons & Dragons is Shadowrun. Now, Shadowrun incorporates a lot of things from Dungeons & Dragons because Shadowrun is a fantasy science fiction game. It kind of mixes science fiction and fantasy together. So you have elves and dwarves and trolls and wizards that you would have from Dungeons & Dragons, but in a near futuristic setting. So it's like near future, where Traveller's far future, you're in spaceships kind of traveling around the universe. Shadowrun is near future, so it's like Blade Runner, where it's more Earth-based, but you've got advanced technology. And like I said, it incorporates those elements from Dungeons & Dragons or from fantasy, but where you, instead of having a dragon who's sitting on his hoard of treasure in some dungeon somewhere, he's instead going to be sitting in the boardroom, or he's going to be his treasure is now, he still has treasure, but his treasure is now his control of different mega corporations, and he uses those corporations to enact his evil, and you have to kind of stop him from acting that way. And that's what's kind of interesting about Shadowrun, is how it kind of blends those science fiction and those fantasy elements into one game, and that's what I like about it. My number 7th favorite role-playing game that's not Dungeons & Dragons, I would just call the Star Wars role-playing game. And that's because Fantasy Flight, who puts out the Star Wars role-playing game now, always has a tendency to break up their role-playing game into multiple different core books. They did it with the Warhammer 40k role-playing game back in the day, and they're doing that now again with Star Wars for some reason. So for example, we've got Edge of Empire, which is a role-playing game that's set in the Star Wars universe, where it focuses on scoundrels and smugglers. So think of like Han Solo and Chewbacca, or the Mandalorian's TV series. And they'll have another role-playing game called Force and Destiny, which focuses on the Jedi characters. But they use the same rule system, so you can play, and they take place obviously in the same universe, so you can kind of play them together. And that's how I prefer to think of them, as is the Star Wars role-playing game. And that's what I would put here at my number 7. What I like about the Star Wars role-playing game, there's not really a lot to really explain because I just really like Star Wars. So in the Star Wars role-playing game, you get to play in the Star Wars universe. You get to go to some of your favorite settings. You can go to Hoth, you can go to Tatooine. You can interact with some of your favorite Star Wars characters from the movies or the expanded universe. And that's why it is my number 7 role-playing game that's not Dungeons and Dragons. My number 6 role-playing game that's not Dungeons and Dragons is another fantasy role-playing game, and that is the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game. And the one thing I really like about the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game is the setting. Most people are familiar with the Warhammer setting from the Warhammer miniature game, and that's where it kind of got its start. The Warhammer setting was created for the tabletop miniature game, but because the setting was so rich and so interesting, they actually made a role-playing game set in that universe. Now, it's really the setting that I really like about the game over its mechanics, and I've actually probably played more in the Warhammer world using Dungeons and Dragons than I have using the Warhammer role-playing game mechanics. But I have played in the Warhammer role-playing game using its game, and there are things about it I like. One of the things I like about the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game is that you don't have a character class, you have a career. So those careers are going to be more grounded in realistic careers. So instead of being a rogue, you're going to be like a rat catcher. Instead of being a fighter, you're going to be maybe a knight, or something like that. So it's more grounded in like realistic occupations. So your character, because it takes place in kind of a warped version of medieval Europe, or medieval, or just kind of a fantasy Earth. Because if you look at the map of the Warhammer universe, it is a warped version of Earth. So the old world, which is Europe, it looks like the European map to some extent. And the different kingdoms that you have in the old world are kind of based off of different medieval European countries. So you'll have like the Empire, which is kind of based off the Holy Roman Empire. So all the characters have kind of like Germanic names. Or you have Britannia, which is like a weird mix between France and Britain. Has a kind of King Arthur theme to it. And that's kind of what I like about it, is because it has this kind of gritty realism of a medieval Europe. And the characters, or the like I said, the character careers that you play are going to be careers that you would see in the traditional medieval European setting. And that's what I like about that setting. And that is why it's my number 6 role-playing game that's not Dungeons and Dragons. My number 5 role-playing game that's not Dungeons and Dragons is Mutants and Masterminds. Mutants and Masterminds is kind of a generic superhero role-playing game. Though most of the time I've played this one, I've played it using the kind of the Marvel Universe setting. Because Mutants and Masterminds, it doesn't have a license for Marvel or DC, so it can't use those characters. It can't use Spider-Man, it can't use Superman. But you can see by the different superpowers that your characters can acquire when you're building your character that you could build any character that you're familiar with from any kind of comic book. And like I said, I usually, when I played Mutants and Masterminds, I played it in the Marvel setting. But you could make up your own superhero universes if you wanted using Mutants and Masterminds. It uses a version of the D20 system, so anybody who's played Dungeons and Dragons is going to be familiar with that system and can play Mutants and Masterminds. And that's what I like about it. It's kind of my go-to superhero role-playing game. My number 4th favorite role-playing game that's not Dungeons and Dragons is also another fantasy role-playing game, though, and that is Ars Magica. Ars Magica takes place in a kind of mythical Europe. Whereas the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game is kind of a warped version of Europe, Ars Magica actually takes place in Europe. So you're in England, you're in France. But all the fairy tales that and all the myths that exist that fantasy is based off are actually true in Ars Magica. Also, the other thing about Ars Magica that I like is wizards are much more powerful than they would be in, like, say, Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons worries about game balance. So if someone's playing a wizard character, that wizard, though, is powerful, it shouldn't be more powerful than somebody else's rogue character or someone else's warrior character. So the game has to really kind of maybe neuter wizard characters and buff up other character classes to kind of create some balance between those characters, so the wizards are not overshining the other character classes in Dungeons and Dragons. Ars Magica doesn't worry about that. What Ars Magica does is it just says wizards are more powerful, and I like wizards. That's why it's Wizards Keep. But in Dungeons and Dragons, or in Ars Magica, you don't have to worry about game balance because everybody has a wizard character. In Ars Magica, you make multiple characters. You make your wizard character and you make your non-wizard character. And so when you go on a mission or go on an adventure, you may only have one or two wizards in that party. So let's say I'm playing on a mission, and this time I'm playing my wizard character. The other players will play in their non-wizard characters, and that's my moment to shine. So now my character is much more powerful than the other players' characters. So I get to be the Gandalf doing all these kind of heroic things in the mission. But maybe in a future session, now my wizard's busy. My wizard, wizards don't have time to necessarily go on adventures. They're studying spells, they're creating magic items, or just researching the finer things of magic. And so they're in their laboratories or they're in their libraries, so they can't go out on missions. So in a future session, now my wizard is off in his library studying, so I'm going to play my non-wizard character, and another player gets to play their wizard character. So now they get to shine with their character being the most powerful character in the party. But it also creates other great role-playing opportunities, because now I can create different characters that have a wide range of personalities. So my wizard character, when I role-play it may have one personality, but my non-wizard character may have a different personality. And so now when I'm playing on this, I can keep things fresh. So now when I'm playing on a mission, I get to role-play a totally different character. Or maybe I have a concept or a different character. So where my wizard's my main character that I'm going to use and play on the missions. But while he's busy doing something else, I can make this new character because I just had this moment of inspiration, had this new idea. So now I can play this new character and go on this mission with it. And that's what I really like about Ars Magica. My number 3 favorite role-playing game that's not Dungeons & Dragons is Legends of the Five Rings. Now, what I like about Legends of the Five Rings is, much like the Warhammer fantasy role-playing game, is its setting. Legends of the Five Rings takes place in kind of a fantastical feudal Japan, and the setting's called Rokugan. And so, you have different kind of clans, and each clan has its own kind of flavor to it. So, you've got like the Scorpion clan, who is a very deceptive clan, trading in secrets and backstabbing. You've got the Lion clan, which is very noble and honorable, and their honor is very, very important to them. And it's just that richness of the different clans that makes that world very interesting. Now, also like Warhammer, where the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game was developed as this tabletop miniature game, and the world was so rich they created a role-playing game about it. Legends of the Five Rings has kind of a similar history in the sense that it started off as a collectible card game like Magic the Gathering, but the world was so interesting and so in depth that they were able to create a role-playing game based on it. And that's what I really like about the Legends of the Five Rings role-playing game, is just its interesting setting. My number 2 favorite role-playing game that's not Dungeons & Dragons is also another role-playing game where you play different clans, and that is Vampire the Masquerade. But except these clans are clans of vampires. So in Vampire the Masquerade, you're not playing a wizard, you're not playing a warrior, you don't have a class. Instead, you pick a clan, which is a type of vampire, because everybody gets to play a different vampire. And those clans each have their own kind of theme and flavor to them as well. So you might be playing the Nosferatu clan, which is like the movie Nosferatu. They're disfigured, but because of that disfiguredness, they hide away in the shadows. But that gives them different advantages because they're in the shadows all the time. They learn different secrets, and they kind of can trade in secrets, or they use those secrets against other people, probably other vampires, because there's also a lot of political intrigue in Vampire the Masquerade, because all the different vampires are kind of vying for power, and you can't just kind of go out and fight in the streets with your vampires. They have to be much more diplomatic, and they have to be much more political, because that's what the game is called, the Vampire the Masquerade. Because what the Masquerade is that the vampires have to keep themselves hidden, because though vampires are powerful, there's many more humans out there, or many more mortals out there. And also vampires have different weaknesses. They have to, they're kind of catatonic during the daylight, and sunlight causes them damage. So they have to maintain this masquerade, because if humans ever discover their existence, they would hunt them down and destroy all of the vampires, because the vampires feed on humans. And so that's another aspect of the game I like, is you've got that kind of thing, you know, the extra layer of things you have to worry about. And there's also the horror theme. I'm a big fan of the horror genre, and so that's why Vampire the Masquerade is my number 2 favorite role-playing game that's not Dungeons & Dragons. And my number 1 favorite role-playing game that is not Dungeons & Dragons also is kind of in line with Vampire the Masquerade, and that's another horror-themed role-playing game, and that is Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is a role-playing game based around the mythology or the mythos, the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. And H.P. Lovecraft kind of, he had his own kind of unique style of horror, and the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game kind of embraces that. The other thing I like about the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, it has a very, very simple rule system. It's just a percentile rule system, meaning that if you're going to do an action, you check a skill and see what your skill is, and it'll have a number like 65. And so what that means is you roll percentile dice. If you roll equal to or less than 65%, you're going to succeed. If you roll over, you fail. So it's really, really simple. So you can concentrate on the story. You can concentrate on the role-playing game, which I think is very important to horror role-playing games. So this is more about the mood and the theme of the game. And Call of Cthulhu, you're able to do that very easily. Call of Cthulhu can be kind of played in many different settings. Its default setting is the 1920s, that's because most of the writings of H.P. Lovecraft kind of took place in the 1920s, because that's when he lived. But you can run Call of Cthulhu in the Dark Ages. You can run it in the modern day, where a modern day version of Call of Cthulhu would be filled, sort of like the X-Files, where you're kind of investigators into the strange paranormal, but you can using modern day technology. Like instead of going to a dusty old library and searching through tomes, now you're searching the internet. Though my favorite setting is the kind of the 1920s, because it's kind of got this weird quirkiness of where you've got some technology that we have today, like telephones, you've got cars, you've got electricity, but it's all really rudimentary and doesn't work quite the same way as it does now. Also, horror is more about isolation, and when you get into the 1920s or the further in the past, it is easier to isolate the characters. Meaning if they don't have their cell phone to call for help, now they're kind of abandoned out in the woods somewhere, and that kind of ratchets up the tension. And that's the things I like about Call of Cthulhu, is that horror and that tension. And that's why it is my number 1 role-playing game that is not Dungeons & Dragons. Well, thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions about any of these role-playing games, or any role-playing games in general, feel free to contact me on Facebook or on YouTube. And until then, thank you for watching this video.